Hey, good morning, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Finally getting logged on here this morning. I made the cardinal sin of letting my computer that we use to do the program update before the program. I thought I had plenty of time, and as it turns out, plenty of time was 5 minutes, not enough time. So we're a little late getting started here this morning. Got a long list of notes along with your questions. If anybody logs in today, anticipating kind of a light crowd because you're probably either in the field thinking about going to the field, sleeping in because you were in the field all night, or fixing something so you can get back into the field. So that's kind of the way things go around our place anyway. So had a chance to take a road trip to DeSoto, Iowa yesterday to take a transmission core back to get my money back on that. It's a long story. But anyway, I was a little surprised, frankly, that once I crossed the river at the Quad Cities, headed west on Interstate 80, I could have missed a few, but I saw a grand total of two fields planted between the Mississippi and 20 miles west of Des Moines, Iowa. So very little planting done on Interstate 80 in Iowa. I know in parts of Iowa they got started early, just like we did. Maybe more to the west, um, and in places where it had been drier. A lot of fields worked, a lot of stuff ready to plant. They received a lot more rain from the system that went through day before yesterday than we did, so they were recently wet and could not have been in the field yesterday if they had wanted to. But very little planting been done, honestly, in a lot of Illinois as well. Southern Illinois has been too wet. Eastern Illinois had been a little wetter than us. Northern Illinois has been wetter than us, and there is nowhere in Illinois that has more planted than Adam Henniger's territory. So Adam was busy this morning moving seed around and doing his FSR duties to take care of his dealers and his customers. So he couldn't join me here this morning, but I wish he could have, because the vast majority of this list of questions here was actually provided to me by Adam based on conversations he's had with growers the last 2 weeks in his territory. I would hazard a guess that Adam's territory might be 75% planted. Maybe that's a little high, but I know he's got guys who are done. Um, and he's got a lot more in the ground than really anybody else in the state does. And really, that I-72 corridor headed east towards Springfield. Lot of planting has been done. Quite a bit of planting has been done here in my part of Western Illinois, and just kind of depends on how dry you were early, how willing you were to take advantage of some of those early windows that maybe seemed too early. And if you were bold enough to take advantage of the early windows, you could, in theory, have a lot of crop planted. Adam he sent us a picture of let's see if I can count the leaves on this. So this corn would be it's not quite V2, but it's close. It's about V1.5. And he had some people that were bold enough to put some corn in the ground around the 20th of March or so, and that stuff's up and got decent look to it. It's a little uneven. It looks like it has struggled a little bit, but frankly, I'm surprised it's as big as it is. Probably wasn't planted super deep, would be my guess. And we do have a planting depth question coming up here on Ask the Agronomist this morning when we get a little further down the list. So and Adam also reported that he's got a lot of corn spiking through in his territory, a lot of beans cracking. So not only does he have a lot of acres planted, he's in the process of getting quite a few acres emerged. So forecast looks a little a little harsh here for the next 5 days or so, but not awful. And in my forecast, I've got 4 nights below 40, 34 being the coldest of those nights, and 3 days where we're not forecasted to reach 60. But that's not awful. That's basically going to bring growth and crop development to a standstill. But that's not bitterly cold. Doesn't look like we're going to get terribly wet. Supposed to get some moisture today, but there's been other days we were supposed to get moisture and we did not. So as we experienced last year, if you stay dry when you're cold, that generally helps things a little bit. And I don't see anything in the forecast that looks extremely alarming. Probably the biggest concern for these really ultra early planted acres that are going to be emerged here in April would be the infamous May freeze. And we will have, in some areas, a lot of crop that is big enough by that time. If we should get one of those, it will not survive a freeze, being the size it's going to be in May. So looks like that stuff's going to get out of the ground just fine. And people who were, concerned about, getting the crop out of the ground can breathe a sigh of relief. Now the only thing we have to be nervous about is, what kind of temperatures do we get in May? I will continue to argue, somewhat feel like a man shouting at a storm, that there really isn't any data to indicate there's any sort of a benefit to planting beans much earlier than April 1st, or planting corn much earlier than April 15th. And the back end of the highest yielding bean window is probably somewhere around May 5th. And the back end of the highest yielding corn window is probably somewhere around May 20th. So, if you were to ask me, and you're not, but if you were, what do I consider to be the optimum planting window for soybeans? I'll say, early April till early May. And if you ask me what I consider to be the optimum planting window for corn, I would say mid-April till, a little past the middle of May. I think both crops have about a 5-week optimum planting window, and they don't completely overlap. The soybean optimum planting window is about 2 to 3 weeks earlier than the corn optimum planting window. And so, in recent years, more and more people have gotten comfortable starting with beans, giving beans the priority early. And then at some point, if you don't get done with your beans before you feel it's time to switch to corn, then you make the switch to corn and you finish up with soybeans. And soybeans are, have the unique feature of, not only do they benefit the most from early planting versus corn, they're also more forgiving of very late planting. So, in a worst case scenario, let's say you start planting soybeans, and then it gets to be late April and you're uncomfortable that you haven't planted any corn yet, and you start planting corn, and then you get, rained out at some point, and we're rained out for a long period of time, and we end up finishing planting in June, which we've done before. It's never our goal, but it happens. I would much rather be planting soybeans in June than I would planting corn. So it is a risk to stay on soybeans too long if you start with soybeans, and there's always that debate of, if you start with beans and you don't have the ability or the equipment or the labor to plant both crops at the same time, how long do I stay with beans before I switch to corn? And my thought process on that is, probably by late April, I'm going to want to be started on corn. So, if you can get your soybeans done by April 25th, I don't have a problem with you staying on beans until they're done, and you don't plant a kernel of corn until all your beans are in the ground. But you may not be comfortable waiting until April 25th to start planting corn. The reality of this is we don't know what the best time to plant is. We don't know what the worst time to plant is, and we don't know how many days of good planting conditions you're going to have. And a lot of people have had a lot of success following the adage of, if the soil's fit, I'm going to plant. And people who like to follow that adage have got a lot planted. People who are more patient, who are looking at the calendar date, who are looking at the forecast, who are looking at the soil temperature, who are looking at what's available to me for replant seed if I have to replant, may not have started yet. So we're in that time of year, and we have this period in every planting season where you've got people who are done and you got people who haven't started yet, and everything in between. So, as a percentage statewide, not much has been planted. But in certain local areas, and West Central Illinois would be the epicenter of this, there are places where there is a lot planted. So if you've traveled through Hancock County, if you've traveled through Adams County, if you've traveled through Pike County, if you've traveled through Schuyler County, you well know there is a lot of crop planted in some areas. So let's talk a little bit about with the weather that's coming in. There's been a lot of questions the last few days. When should I shut the corn planter down? Should I shut the corn planter down? Should I have started the corn planter yet? Do I have to shut the bean planter down? All those questions are out there, and you can find all sorts of helpful, unhelpful advice on the internet and chat rooms and wherever you want to go. Somebody will have an opinion on whether or not you should shut the planter down, and if so, when. And all this is really driven by the fact that about 10 years ago, smart people started talking about something called imbibitional chilling. Imbibitional is not the easiest word to say. I would recommend that you practice it before you try to say it live on the internet, because it's a bit of a tongue twister. But really, what all imbibitional chilling is, it's stress, or if severe enough, injury to the cell walls in the embryo of a seed. And it's caused by that seed imbibing water that's colder than, I've seen 38 degrees, certainly colder than 40 degrees. So if you've got seed that's imbibing, or it's just a fancy word for soaking up or drinking, as some people like to say, if you've got seeds that are imbibing water that is colder than 40 degrees, that's where imbibitional chilling can occur. Now, that does not kill the seed, does not kill the germ, does not prevent the plant from emerging, does not necessarily mean anything awful is going to happen, but it's an indicator of stress. And stress impacts every seed in your field differently, because every seed in your field is different. They are not all the same. They are not all laying in the same soil. They are not all planted in the same direction. They do not all have the same micro environment right there around that seed. And so, what imbibitional chilling does is it puts stress on the seed, and it induces more variability into your field, because it impacts others. It might completely kill some seeds. It might prevent some seeds from emerging. It might cause some seeds to emerge 24 hours later than they otherwise would have. It might cause other seeds to emerge 48 hours later than they otherwise would have. It might make some seeds emerge a week later than they otherwise would have. And so the field just gets less uniform. And that's where the yield loss comes from. So, if you lose stand, if you lose plants, obviously you're losing yield potential. If you lose uniformity, you're losing yield potential. Now, the same thing happens in soybeans. Soybeans can suffer from imbibitional chilling as well, but they don't necessarily feel the yield loss like corn does, because they are far more tolerant to losing stand and losing uniformity at the time of emergence. And you couple that with the fact that there is a huge benefit in yield potential to planting soybeans early. There is not with corn. There is little, if any, data out there that I consider to be credible that would indicate that there's any yield benefit to planting corn before the 20th to the 25th of April. There's all kinds of data that shows that soybeans planted, earlier in April always do better than beans planted, after May 5th. Uh, you've got a crop that benefits more from the earlier planting date, and you've got a crop that suffers less from a lack of uniformity, a loss of stand, and more uneven emergence. So, for that reason, I'm certainly more accepting of people sticking beans in the ground ahead of a crappy weather forecast. I'm more comfortable with people sticking beans in the ground right ahead of a rain event. Now, it's still true whether you're planting corn or soybeans. If you're planting in moist soil and that moist soil doesn't have a chance to dry out after you plant it, and it gets a pounding rain on it right after you plant it, it's going to set up like cement. That's got nothing to do with imbibitional chilling either. That's just soil getting hard. That's soil getting crusted. That's a soil that seed's going to have to struggle to push through. And that creates yet another variable because it's going to be harder to push through the soil here than it is over there versus over there. And so you're just continuing to throw things at that crop stand that is going to induce more variability in that stand. And with corn, that's a big concern. Increasing variability in corn stands almost always hurts your yield potential, and that brings up another topic that we actually talked about this I think 2 weeks ago when we were live at our first Ask the Agronomist live. Someone asked the question about does stress on corn reduce its yield potential? And there's been talk of this over the years that does an individual plant that comes up over 4 weeks and has to struggle to emerge lose any genetic yield potential versus an individual plant that comes up in 5 days and flies out of the ground and didn't have to hardly lift a finger to emerge? Now, if they're side by side, the answer to that is, obviously yes, because that plant that is 3 weeks behind in emergence is probably going to be more like a weed than a corn plant. But genetically, that stress of emergence is not doing anything to reduce the yield potential of that individual plant. However, the longer it takes for that plant to come up, and the more it struggles to come up, and the harder it has to work to come up, the more likely it is to be behind its neighbor, the more likely it is to be infected with seedling blight, crown rot, other pathogens, the more likely it is to have root health problems. The more likely it, might have been impacted by insect feeding or some other stress. The longer it takes to come up, and the more hell it goes through to get up, the more likely there's something else wrong with that plant. And the other things that are wrong with that plant is what's going to reduce the yield. So the fact that it used up all of its oomph, so to speak, to get out of the ground, and the fact that it struggled is not reducing the genetic yield potential that seed had when you put it in the ground. However, that seed with that genetic yield potential that you put in the ground is now a plant that has problems. And those problems are going to plague that plant all year long. No matter how much fungicide you throw at it, no matter how much nitrogen you side dress it with, no matter how much fertility you have in your soil, the problems that those plants are plagued with through the season are going to drag down their ability to produce grain. And that's where the yield loss comes from stands that struggle. It's not that you're reducing the genetic yield potential that the seed had when you put it in the ground. It's that you're reducing the ability of the plant to produce the genetic yield potential that the seed had when you put it in the ground, based on the things that it's going to be dealing with through the growing season. So, another interesting question that Adam had gotten from a grower was there is there anything you can do for wireworms after planting? So there's not that many great options for wireworm control, period. And they all have to happen before planting. So I'm not aware with today's products of anything, you know, when Lorsban was available, if you could have like banded Lorsban right above the row and irrigated or rained it in, could you have made some wireworms a little sick? Maybe. If you had a way to band Force or Aztec above the row and rain it in, or irrigate it in, would that do something? Possibly. Our pyrethroid insecticides, our foliar insecticides, are the kind of insecticides that you could easily spray on a field, are not going to do anything to wireworms. The best protection against wireworms is actually a high rate Poncho 1250 seed treatment. So generally, what happens with wireworms is when you realize you got them and you didn't know you had them and you didn't protect yourself from them, the following year you take measures to make sure that wireworms don't ruin your stand of corn. And for several years after that, you take measures to make sure wireworms don't do anything to ruin the stand of your corn, because they have a 7-year life cycle and you don't really know where you're at in that 7-year life cycle. And so usually when somebody has a bad experience with wireworms, they go kind of overboard protecting their crop from wireworms for several years, at least in that particular field. They might even start doing it in other fields. And I remember when Dr. Kevin Steffi was entomologist at U of I, he always joked that if you wanted to prevent, have him come out and do a research trial to study that pest, and that would virtually guarantee that it would not make an appearance in that field. And that's the nature of things like wireworms and grubs and grape calaspis and some of those type of pests to be ahead of time. And honestly, if you spend money on every acre to protect yourself from some of those pests, you may spend more money on the control measures you take than you save in yield on the 1% of your acres, maybe, or 2% of your acres that was going to be impacted by that pest. So there are things you can do preventatively. And again, Poncho 1250 seed treatment's probably the best. Soil applied insecticides have activity on those sort of pests. You got to be at full rates. With some pests, they might want that in furrow rather than in a T band to increase the concentration. Depends on where the pest is and how they're going to feed. With wireworm, I think in furrow probably would be better than a T band, just to get the highest concentration of insecticide you can get close to the seed. Which is where those wireworms are going to be active. A T band is going to put a lot of product someplace where the wireworm's really not going to come in contact with it. So to answer Adam's question, directly, no, I'm not aware of anything you can do after planting to save yourself from wireworm. The only thing you can do is maybe make a mental note of, okay, I had a problem in this field. When I go back to corn in that field 2 years from now, am I going to do something proactive to, help control wireworm, or am I going to, in your odds of guessing which one of those approaches is the right one for 2 years from now? Because the populations of those pests do vary from year to year, and they do vary in severity across fields, and they do vary a lot in, are they worth trying to control or not? The one thing that does not vary is it's fairly expensive to control them because the products that you need to use to kill things like wireworms and grubs and grape glaspas are not $5 treatments; they're $25 treatments. So just something to keep in mind. Um, so I had a question come in again from another one of Adam's growers. To kind of a two-part question. So if you're looking at, and we'll talk about fall burn down here in a minute. Again, you're probably getting tired of hearing me talk about fall burn down. If you'd all start doing one, I'd quit talking about it. So that's the way to get me to quit talking about fall burn down. But so this question was, I've got weeds in my field. I could burn it down and no till it, or I can do tillage. What should I do? So, either approach will work. We've got good burn down options. We've got good equipment for no-till. To me, it's more of a philosophical decision rather than an agronomic decision. Because if you prefer tillage, well, then you're always going to prefer tillage, and you're going to use tillage instead of a burn down probably to control those weeds, and that's fine. If you prefer no-till, well, then I would recommend using a burn down to control those weeds and avoid the tillage. The reality is, some of these fields are so overrun with such a thick, lush stand of various different winter annuals. Tillage isn't going to work very good, to be honest with you. You're going to get muskrat huts of trash piling up, balling up, and not flowing through that tillage tool very well. Some of the chickweed's especially nasty. I mean, you can wad chickweed up in a ball, and that stuff almost just kind of sticks to itself. So if you pull into a field of nasty, thick chickweed with a field cultivator, that's not going to end well. I can predict that. If you pull into that field with a soil finisher, it will end better, but it ain't going to be great either. If you go in there with some sort of vertical tool, that's going to chop it up. Probably not going to get it all out. And related to this question, there was a question that came in about, well, how deep should I do tillage in the spring? So that question also, there's a lot of philosophical aspects to that. It depends somewhat on what's your purpose for doing tillage. Are you doing tillage to level a field from primary tillage? Well, then you just need to work it deep enough to get it level enough it plants nice. Are you doing tillage for weed control? If you're doing tillage for weed control, your tillage, no point in doing tillage and only removing half of your weeds if you're there for weed control. So our vertical till machines do a great job of leveling. They do a great job of making a seed bed. They are not good at all at removing weeds because some of them are better than others. If your vertical tillage tool 20 years ago would have been called a disc, then it's pretty good at removing weeds because you're moving lots of soil. If your vertical tillage tool has straight blades and is more like a harrow, then it's not going to be great at removing weeds. So kind of depends on what's the purpose of your tillage, how deep it should be. I mean, I would say, and ideally, I wouldn't want to work the ground any deeper than you have to in the spring, because the deeper you go, the more wet stuff you're going to get into, the more compaction you're going to create, um, the more of a horizontal layer that you have the potential to put in if those sweeps are running in some soil that's wetter than the soil that was dry on top. I can't help but reiterate one of my favorite sayings to pick on is, and that's if you've ever uttered the phrase, I opened the soil up to dry it out, that translates to, I worked it wet. So if your purpose of spring tillage is to dry the soil out to get it dry enough to plant, you're doing some damage when you make that spring tillage pass. and the tool that you do it with is going to have some impact on what level of damage you're doing. Some people do tillage to get a seed bed. No tillers have scoffed at that for decades. I don't do any tillage at all, and I've got a nice seed bed. So why do you think you need to do tillage to have a nice seed bed? And again, that's a personal preference thing. That's like being a Cubs versus Cards fan. Typically, neither one of those teams is as good as you want them to be. But which one do you want to root for? Take your pick. But so anyway, that's my thoughts on do I do a burn down? And again, on the burn down subject, if your goal of your burn down is to prevent seed production from that free cover crop of winter annuals that's growing in your field, it needed to be done already. We've got a lot of seed that's been set on a lot of that stuff, and it reseeds itself extremely effectively. Has anybody ever planted any henbit? Yet it's everywhere. So that stuff, they're prolific seed producers. They produce seeds. So I was talking to a guy the other day. I was taking pictures of some fall burn down. Neighborly neighbor stops just to, he thought maybe I was having truck troubles or something. And so he actually, he doesn't farm anymore, but he used to, and he knows farmers. And so he started asking about all the weeds in the fields. And he goes, well, they're gonna die pretty soon. They're not really hurting anything, are they? And I'm like, well, I mean, in theory, you could say that they're gonna complete their life cycle before corn even gets started, and so they really don't necessarily compete with the crop the same way our summer annual weeds do, like giant ragweed, and lamb's quarter, and water hemp, and all that stuff. So the winter annual weeds are going to complete their life cycle, and they're going to die off. And even if you don't kill them in a burn down, they're going to die early enough that, yeah, they're not going to ruin, your corn crop from a weed competition standpoint. But they make for an awful seed bed. They make for awful planting conditions. They make for awful tillage conditions. They harbor pests. Some of those species, henbit in particular, is an alternate host for soybean cyst nematode. It's, yeah, I know from a soil biology standpoint, it's good to have a live root growing in soil, but I would rather that live root be ryegrass or crimson clover or oats or turnips or radishes than henbit, chickweed, pennycress, shepherd's purse, mare's tail, and all that other crap that we could kill with a fall burn down. And I'm going to try to do something here, and I hope it's something you can see. I took a video yesterday of a landscape, and if I had gotten my pilot's license to fly the drone that Bear has provided to me, it would probably be better to use a drone to fly this rather than trying to stand in the back of my pickup truck to get this view for you. But I'm going to try to play this video. It has audio on it, which hopefully you can hear. Now there is some wind in this, so I'm going to do a little bit of a panoramic view here. Every field that you can see is either long-term or rotational no-till field. So none of that's pasture. That's all crop field. Completely, except for the trees, overrun with winter annual weeds. And coming into view, you will see something that looks a little different. And on the far hill, you can see something that looks a little different. That's where I grew up, by the way. And as you look north on this farm, every field you see looks a little different. What's the difference? Roundup and Autumn Super fall burn down. That was some horrible marketing there, because when I went to say Autumn Super, by comparison, and all this ground here, the wind blocked me out. Continuous no-till for over 40 years. So it has winter annual weed pressure. All that was actually fall vertical tilled. As in, I actually see that. Okay. That's enough of that. You get the idea. So I couldn't remember exactly when we sprayed that. So I checked with my retailer this morning. That application was made November 8th last fall. That, in my opinion, is kind of right in the middle of a good time to do fall burn down. I mean, I don't like to get super early because then you're putting more pressure on the residual that you're using. If you're willing to wait till late November or December, you don't even need the residual. The residual really doesn't do much for you in the spring. The purpose of the residual is to keep the field clean the rest of the fall if you're chasing right behind the combine with your fall burn down. Because if you're out there early in the fall, there's a good chance there's some stuff that may be still coming up that if you just spray like a Roundup 2,4-D or a 2,4-D dicamba, you might not prevent that stuff from coming up. And that's where things like Autumn Super or Valor or some of our stronger residual products can be very useful in a fall burn down. But lots of things are making the winter annuals be really bad this year. I think certainly the early warm up that we experienced in February and March. We've had pretty good moisture this spring. It hasn't necessarily been wet, but it hasn't been a drought either. And I think in some cases, especially in corn, not necessarily in soybeans, but especially in corn, we had a lot of reduced crop canopy in cornfields last year. So there was a lot more sunlight hitting the ground in August and September than normal, stimulating that those winter annuals to get going and germinate and start growing. So certainly a banner year for lots of species of winter annual weeds. Probably more people than ever have a passion today to do a fall burn down this fall. What typically happens is between now and November 8th, you lose the passion to spend the money to do that. And you start looking at budgets and you start looking at, well, is it really worth what it costs? And it's been 6 months since you couldn't stand to look at those fields and they look fine. On November 8th, nothing ever looks bad. I mean, yeah, you can see there's some weeds there, but they're little. You only see about 10% of them. The 90% you don't see are the ones that are going to really bite you in the ass in the spring. But we lose our nerve to pull the trigger and make those applications in the fall. So make a note on your calendar, like like late October, early November. Block out like 3 weeks on your calendar, write fall burn down on it. Just as a reminder that on April, what is today? April 18th, some of you were wishing you'd done a fall burn down last fall. And the way to not be wishing next spring, so a year from now, the way to not be wishing you'd done a fall burn down is to do one. So do your fall burn downs this fall. Lots of options. I mean, you can go with Roundup, you can go without Roundup. I never do anything without Roundup myself. You can use 2,4-D, you can use dicamba, you can use residual products like Autumn Super, which that's what mine was Roundup and Autumn Super. Autumn Super by itself's got a lot of burn down capabilities, so it's not just a residual. So a lot of people will run like just Autumn Super 2,4-D. And if you don't have any hard to kill grasses in your field, that's probably going to be just as good as my Autumn Super Roundup, and it'll be cheaper. But I like my Roundup. So anyway, enough on fall burn down. Adam had a question on management considerations for second year soybeans. So I don't think that means that there's a trend going on towards second year soybeans, but I've done second year soybeans 3 or 4 different times. I frankly prefer to do that than to do corn on corn. if I've got a farm that I'm changing the field split on, or I want to get it all in one crop, I'm going to have 25 acres of second year beans this year. Not because I don't want to plant corn, not because I believe in beans on beans, but because I got a small farm that's split in half with two 25-acre fields, and I want it all in one crop. And so you're going to have to go back on top of something. And as a no-tiller that doesn't like to do a lot of tillage, it's a lot easier for me to do beans on beans than it is corn on corn. So the considerations that I took on this particular field, I picked a bean that had really good overall plant health. I picked a bean that I thought was highly adapted to the environment it was going into, because it's going to be, in theory, under more stress, being second year soybeans. I would try to avoid doing it on farms that have a really bad cyst problem. I would try to avoid doing it on farms with a history of white mold. I would try to avoid doing it on farms with a history of SDS. I would definitely not do it if I was not a believer in fungicide in soybeans. The biggest disaster I've ever seen, one of the few disasters I've ever seen from second year beans, was in a situation where they did not believe in spraying fungicide. And the diseases and seed quality issues that they had were just awful. And so, I think being aggressive with your plant health program makes sense. Picking a bean that has good tolerance to the major soybean diseases makes sense. In a perfect world, using a bean that had a better cyst protection would make sense. So there are a few Peking beans out there. So do you consider throwing a Peking out there for the second year beans to give a little added cyst protection? I would certainly recommend a seed treatment, strong seed treatment. So I'd want a Levo on there if they were mine, for the dual protection of SDS and cyst nematode. So if the trait system you want to use doesn't really offer a Peking option, putting a Levo on that seed is going to somewhat accomplish the same thing by giving you stronger cyst protection than what you're going to get just out of the soybean itself. Seed treatment's a no-brainer. Got to be fully treated seed. From a planting date perspective, that might not be the field I want to plant first. In theory, you're going to have, maybe more potential for SDS, and early planted beans, do tend to have, more potential for SDS. I also think you need to, maybe put a little bit of thought into, is this field a good field for second year beans? So historically, how good of a bean farm is it? Do you have disease problems in beans? Are the beans always sucky on that farm anyway? Are you always disappointed in the beans on that farm? Well, if you answer yes to those questions, that would not be a wise choice to me to make that farm be my beans on bean farm. But if you've got a farm that, the other thing I would consider too is, how good was the bean crop you're following? So were the beans you raised on that farm the year before, were they riddled with disease? Did you have lots of, charcoal rot, diaporthy, SDS, dead spots in the soybean fields? Was that a field that was making 60 when other beans were making 80? That field needs to go to corn. But if the beans you raised on that farm last year looked great, yielded great, didn't see any problems, then I don't think it's that sinful to put that field back to soybeans. You just need to put a little thought into it. I think you'll be fine. Let's see. Okay, so this is one that Adam asked us to cover as well. So we've all got these amazing planter monitors, that will tell you how your planter is functioning out to about 4 decimal points. And, we know our spacing, we know our singulation, we know our population. And when you get that 99.8, 99.9% singulation, you just feel all warm inside. And you're thinking, all right, man, I am doing everything I can do to make this my best corn crop ever. And then when that singulation dips to 97.2, you're on the phone to your seed dealer going, what in the hell is wrong with this corn? What seed size did you bring me? I can't plant this stuff. People go all crazy when the singulation starts to drop a little bit. I got bad news for the planter, the planter manufacturers out there. You're going to have a hell of a hard time finding any yield difference in a real field of corn between a 97% singulation and a 99% singulation. In theory, is there yield loss occurring there? Yes. Is that yield loss measurable? Maybe on an individual plant basis in a research trial, but on a real farm across a real field of corn, you got so many other things going on that's got way more to do with what your corn's going to yield than whether your singulation was 97 or 99. So don't come unhinged if your singulation dips a little bit. If you can get the seed that your planter loves and you can keep it at 99.9, good for you. If you can't, you're still good corn. Don't sweat the small stuff. And there's lots of things that are going to impact how good a crop you produce. And if you're you know if you're planting corn in harsh conditions where it's going to take 3 or 4 weeks to come up, and it's going to struggle, and there's a chance it's going to get crown rot and seedling blight, and you're going to lose some stand, then 90% singulation is good enough. Some of the things that we do are a little crazy sometimes. You're planting stuff in a situation that's likely to not end well, and worried about singulation. So singulation's not as high on my list of things to be worried about as some other things. So have a little grace. The dealers work hard, the FSRs work hard. Everybody works hard to get you as close to what you want as we can. If it's the right hybrid, if it's the hybrid you wanted, if it's a seed size that your planter's kind of turning its nose up at it, and that singulation's dropping all the way down to 97 point something, that's okay. You're still a good farmer. You're still raising good corn. It's a little bit like all the schools that canceled class early on what was that, Tuesday? Yeah, Tuesday, because some weather forecaster said that there might be a tornado somewhere in Western Illinois. You're getting the cart in front of the horse a little bit there, and focusing a little too much on the wrong things. So moving on from that. This is another fun one that Adam, somebody had asked Adam about. So there's also been, I can remember a customer I used to work with who, in about, I don't know, 1990 something, read an article in Prairie Farmer that talked about how big seed has more stored food resources and has stronger emergence because it's got more stored food there for that seed so the plant lives off the seed for a period of time until the root system takes over. So in theory, a big seed got more starch there, which is more food for that plant to live off of until the roots take over, versus that little seed that has less starch there. And the seed that has the least starch of all to live off of is sweet corn. And we all know sweet corn can be a little wimpy, and you gotta treat it nice. Although a lot of sweet corn been planted here in early April as well, and it's coming up also. So I think that's another example of where a little bit too worried about theoretical things when there are so many real things that matter. So I don't really think you're going to see any difference. We track all this stuff. We don't see any difference in emergence in the real world as far as stand establishment replants go. We actually replant more 60-pound corn than we do 35-pound corn. So there is, in my opinion, not really a benefit to the seedling of sprouting from a bigger seed. In theory, does it have more stored food reserves? Yes. Does the smallest seed we sell have enough food reserves to get out of the ground? Yes. Does having more than you need to get out of the ground do you any good? No. The root system is going to take over at about V3 ish on any plant, regardless of what side the seed was. So that stuff that's got a big seed, those roots don't develop more slowly. That root system still takes over at the same time. And if there were some extra groceries left in the seed that the plant didn't use, there's not really any benefit to the plant in that. So I wouldn't worry too much about seed size impacting emergence. What impacts emergence is genetics, number one. Well, no, back up. Weather, number one. Genetics, number two. Seed quality, number three. And in that order. And seed size, it's not in the top three, probably not in the top five, might not even be on the list. But the what's going to affect emergence is weather, genetics, seed quality. Don't worry too much about the size. Now, the size and the shape might affect how your planter operates, and that's back to that, you know, 97 point something, still pretty good singulation. Is it as good as 99 point something? No. Can you measure a yield difference between the two? I'm going to say no. So already. Had an interesting question come in. Another one from Adam. So again, I really wish Adam could have been here because I kind of feel like he's responsible for this episode more than I am because he brought a lot of this stuff, from questions he'd been asked. And so he had a grower that had a bit of a mishap with probably broke something on the depth control on a row maybe and didn't catch it. So he had one row that got planted an inch and a half deeper at a whopping 3.5 inches. He was estimating. The guy's got a better planter than I do. I don't think my planter would go that deep. But so all the rows that were at the right depth were at 2 inches, and he's got one row that's at 3.5, and he's wondering, what's the yield impact of that row being behind all the other rows going to be. So I think there'll be three yield impacts there. If it truly is 3.5 inches deep, you're going to have some relatively favorable growing conditions to get the same stand in that row that you have in your other rows. So I'm going to say you're probably going to lose some stand. You're going to lose some plants. There's going to be some seeds out there that can't come up from a depth of 3.5 inches. Because we're not going to have the right weather conditions for that. So let's say you lose 10 or maybe even 20% of your stand in that row. So that's going to be the number one yield impactor. You're going to have more variability in that row because it's going to take a good month probably for that seed to come up from that depth. And in that time, bad things are going to happen, and you're going to get this plant is stressed next to that plant, and you're going to have more variability from plant to plant. And then the third thing is you are going to have a little bit of enhanced competition from the adjacent rows that are going to be further ahead. Now that's probably the least concerning of the three things I mentioned, because most competition that occurs between plants is within the row not between the rows. So as long as the plants in a row are the same size, if they're bigger or smaller than the row next to them, that's not going to be as big of an impact from a yield standpoint. So that's probably not my biggest concern. My biggest concern is can I get enough plants up in that row that we've got reasonable yield potential? Can I get, as long as we get 60% of them up, I mean, 60% of your stand gives you about 80% of your yield. So you're going to have maybe even 85% of your yield. You're going to have reasonable yield out of that row, and even if that row is terribly thin, let's say only half of it comes up. Keep in mind that's one row out of the planter. So if it's I don't know if it's a 12 or 16 or 24 or how big a planter it is, but if you spread that stand loss out across the entire width of the planter, you've still got a good stand of corn. You've really just got one row that's got an issue, and that one row isn't going to impact things. Even if it didn't come up at all, I'm still not replanting that field. You could try to find a one row planter and fill in rows. I've had to do that before, where you have a mechanical issue and you don't catch it, and you got one row that didn't even plant. You can go out and fill that row in just to kind of make the field look better, make yourself feel better, give you some weed control, maybe a little bit of additional yield. But anyway, there will be some stand loss, there will be a delay, there will be some competition, there will be some yield loss because that occurred, but not to the point where you want to do something rash like replant. I think most. Oh, one more thing. So we're coming up on time here. We're actually over time since we started later. Um, but now is also a good time, as you have time. Start paying attention to what your neighbors are planting next to your bean field. So if you've got XtendFlex beans and you want to use dicamba in your pre, a lot easier to use it pre, as everybody knows. But particularly those of you who are planning to spray dicamba post, be talking with those neighbors, find out who's got XtendFlex, find out who's got Enlist, find out what directions those are. If you've got Enlist on one side of a field, depending on which direction it is, that's pretty manageable. You get up to two sides, that gets tougher, and three or more sides, then we don't even need to try to spray dicamba on those beans. But have those conversations with your neighbors. Some people switch trait platforms over the years. Things change. Things change. Obviously, if you've got corn next to your beans, I hope you planted XtendFlex because your neighbor's probably using dicamba in his corn. But if you've got XtendFlex beans that you've got planted with corn next to you, that's the easiest thing you can hope for. And I am pretty fortunate that way on some of my farms. I'm out of sync with some of my neighbors, meaning that we've got different crops, and that used to be a bad thing. You used to want to be in sync with your neighbor. Now, if your neighbor is on a different soybean platform than you're on, you're better to be out of sync with your neighbor, and that way you've got his corn next to your beans, and vice versa, and that really helps out when you're back with you on May 2nd, and at the rate we're going, there's going to be a lot of stuff planted by May 2nd, which hopefully will make you all happy, and hopefully a lot of stuff is up and looking good by May 2nd, and everybody stay safe, and we'll be back with you in 2 weeks. So appreciate your time.